Okay, it's 5:40, so I am going to get things started. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you chose this session. I'm a little biased, of course, but that's because you are in for a real treat. Dr. Troy Hicks works at Central Michigan University. I'm sure that more of his background is going to come out in his presentation this evening, but as someone who has had the privilege of working with him on various projects and initiatives over the last, oh geez, how long has it been, Troy? 10 years, I think?
On and off, yeah.
Yeah, you're in for just some of the best professional learning you can have in a 50-minute session. So without further ado, Dr. Troy Hicks.
Well, thank you so much, Becky, and greetings. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be joining you virtually, and you will have access, view-only access to the slides, which I just dropped as a bit.ly short link. And in the slides, there will be another link, and I'll drop that link a little bit later in the presentation to a shared Google Doc that will also be view only. So you're welcome to copy those and save them to your own drive and use them in whatever way you see fit. So good afternoon again and welcome. And much like Jessica, I want to pause for just a moment to acknowledge that if you were with me in Mount Pleasant, we would be gathered on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner with today at Central Michigan University. And also another acknowledgement that I have taken into heart and doing work this year with my Chippewa River Writing Project colleagues at CMU is to the statement of anti-racism from the National Council of Teachers of English. Being anti-racist is a verb, as our nation seems to grapple with acts of hatred more frequently. We as educators must consider our actions. We need to consider where we've spoken and where we've been silent in terms of quelling the growing violence our country faces. These perpetrators were once our students, and our teaching must therefore be an act that addresses, challenges, and dismantles racism in all its forms. Anti-racist educators actively confront and challenge racism. And I think both of those acknowledgements are especially important as we're talking about a year of pandemic pedagogy. We're talking about a year where, while on the one hand, the silver lining to the COVID cloud is that more and more students have access to devices and Wi-Fi hotspots than anyone has ever had access to before, we also need to be incredibly conscious of the ways in which we're asking students to use those technologies. And not only from an equity and access hardware, software kind of conversation, but also in terms of equipping them with the skills so that they can be thoughtful and productive citizens, as we know we would want them to be based on all the things that we do as social studies educators that's within the C3 framework and just being good-minded citizens. So with all of that, I'd like to jump in, get started. And again, you have the slides for those who just joined in the chat. I will drop the link one more time. You can make a view-only look at the slides and you can copy it to your own Google Drive, and then later we'll be participating and engaging in an activity with a shared Google Doc, which you can then also copy to your own Google Drive. I was also reminded earlier that I should be turning on the closed captioning, and I'm sorry I didn't do that to begin with. All right, so with that, as Becky said, I am a professor of English and education at CMU. I began my career as a middle school language arts teacher, and I've had the honor and privilege of being a National Writing Project site director for over 10 years now. I enjoy working with teachers, and I appreciate the work that you are doing each and every day. While I'm not in the classroom every day, I do continually collaborate with teachers and learn with and from you, and I'm hoping that we'll have some good dialogue tonight as we continue to work together. I'm Hicks Tro pretty much everywhere on Twitter, my website, Gmail, so feel free to reach out if you have questions after the session this evening. Becky and I have been able to work with a group of teachers this year in particular on a Teaching Primary Sources grant through the Library of Congress with Jessica. So our timing of this session as a follow-up is especially important. And as we continue to think about what it is we're doing and how we are trying to engage our students in this era, we need to think about where we begin. And so often when we start the research process with students, we start right here with a fairly blank screen. But where do we go next, I think, is the big question. And often for us as individuals, even as adults and knowledgeable people in the world, we might start with a tool that looks something like this. And most likely, many of our students start with a tool that looks something like this as well. We may possibly start with a space that looks something like this. And, we're not going to get into all the fine grained details about the algorithms of Google versus Yahoo, but the difference between that and that sets up a different expectation for how we begin the searching process. Similarly, we might have our students start someplace like this. And while the screenshot is a bit old and the browser is out of date, the idea is that, of course, they're engaging in social networks and they have lots of opportunities to find information across various social networks like Facebook and Twitter. And more commonly now, they are looking for information in places like this. So as we begin this conversation tonight about how to situate our students in an active form of inquiry, we can hearken back to the words of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, everyone is entitled to his or her own opinion, but not to his or her own facts. And I think that these words continue to resonate. And tonight, what I'm hoping we'll do is move through an activity that will help us think about evaluating web-based sources and to think about all of these types of sources as primary sources. So in an era where the Library of Congress is archiving tweets as primary sources, and people are producing more and more content every day, and we want our students to recognize themselves as content producers, we need to be especially mindful of that. So there's a lot to talk about here. And because I want to really get you into the activity, I'm going to kind of go fast. You have all the slides, but normally this would be a collaborative discussion. We do some breakouts, but I'm going to kind of cut to the chase on this particular slide. And my guess is that many of you have experienced either as a learner or even as a teacher who have offered this to your students, a checklist similar to this one from Kathy Schrock. And the question that I like to pose here is that when these types of checklists became popular in the late 90s and the early aughts, and we started to think about what it was that we were comparing web-based sources to, these lists assume a lot. I would say they assume that print is still primary, that gatekeepers are still evident, and that web-based sources were generally still reliable. You had some different kinds of tools and tips and strategies that you could use. And if they didn't fall within a certain parameter, then of course they were unreliable, but generally people were well-intentioned when putting things on the web, and you could try to figure that out. So then we have this question of, what is it that this matters and how does this happen? So I'll give you a moment just to read this quote and think about this. This comes from some of my writing project colleagues. All right, so as you're reading through that quote from Janet and from Sharon, I'm going to invite you again to think about when you've seen these checklists. How have you used these checklists, and are they the most useful tool nowadays? And one of the things that I like to begin to think about is what I can do to reframe the conversation. What is it that we can do to think about why these checklists may or may not matter? And to do that, I start thinking about the idea of argument. And in this sense, argument becomes a new way of framing this conversation around inquiry. What is it that we want to be able to do with and for our students? Well, if we teach them about argument, and not the talking heads on cable kind of argument, but the kind of argument that is a social practice, the kind of argument that builds towards discourse, and the idea of argument that shows us that we can use evidence in appropriate ways, then that becomes a new way of teaching argument as well. It's not just about put in your thesis, put in your 3 sources, move on to the counter argument, you're all done, but it shows that argument is conversation and we can move forward from there. There are a few slides I'm going to skip past for right now because, again, I want to really get us into the activity. I do kind of help think a little bit to pull out my freshman 101 philosophy, sociology type of class and talk a little bit about epistemology. But I'm going to skip that for now and move on to the good part, which is this. I think so many times we start our inquiry and we have students begin research by saying, you're going to find something, but go find this and add it here. But instead, we need to teach them how to ask questions. Not only ask questions that are going to lead to inquiry, but then ask questions of the things that they find. And so with that, I rely largely on the framework for information literacy for higher education. I know there are a number of other information literacy frameworks out there. For instance, I know that there's civic online reasoning from the Stanford History Education Group, among others. The National Media Literacy Educators have questions about media literacy. ISTE has questions about digital citizenship, but this is one tool that I found especially useful. And I found it useful because it comes out of the work of the American Library Association, and specifically out of the Association of College and Research Libraries. And there are two ideas that really stand out, the two that I've highlighted here. One is that this framework helps us become meta literate, help our students think about being literate about their own literacy. How is it that they can ask questions about the words and phrases and all the things that they see visually in terms of photographs, paintings, graphics that are created? How do they become able to talk about those things? And then how do they not only become better consumers of those artifacts, but also better creators of those artifacts? So when we think about that scale of what students are typically doing, there's usually a lot of consumption, and there might be some creation, but the creation is usually short, succinct, photos, social media posts. How do we help them become creators in more robust ways? And there are 6 elements of the framework. And again, we're not going to talk about all of them in great detail right now, but I will just highlight the top levels of each. The first one is that authority is constructed and contextual. So this gets to the idea that what counts as evidence in one discipline and in one situation may be different than what counts as evidence in a different context and situation. So who is determined to be expert and who has authority to speak as an expert matters depending on context. Part number 2 is that information creation is a process. Certainly you understand this, and especially hearkening to what Jessica just said about people documenting their everyday lives. We create information in a variety of different ways, and it lives in different spaces. But oftentimes we kind of forget that. Artifacts, whether they're real artifacts or they are virtual artifacts, show up in front of us and we forget that somebody had to make that. And it has value, which leads to the third point. It has intellectual value, it has emotional value, it has financial value. There are lots of different values that these sources have, and we need to teach students about all of them. Moving to the bottom row, we think about research being an inquiry-based iterative process. It's not, oh, I'm going to go find that thing, I'm going to put it in my paper, and I'm done. We want to teach students how to keep asking questions. So you ask one question, but then how can we continue to ask more questions? Which then ties to the 5th point, scholarship is conversation. I really like this as a writing teacher. This one is probably one of my favorite elements of the framework, and that is, how do we teach students to enter into the academic dialogue? How do we get them to engage in substantive conversation with their sources and also with one another, to put their voice out into the world? And like the C3 would remind us, to take informed action, to put their voice out there and do it in a way that's going to have substance and make a difference. And then finally, searching is strategic exploration. So it's not just go to the one source, it's go to the source and then continue to go from there. How can we do that? How can we do things like lateral reading? How can we look at multiple sources of information and open up different tabs? How can we go to the works cited and find out more? How can we use social networks to find things that come in on a regular basis? How can we set up RSS feeds and so forth? So there's lots of different elements to this, and I know I'm going ridiculously fast. Let me pause for a moment, both to take a sip of water and to see if anyone might have a question, because we're going to pivot here pretty quickly and I'm going to fast forward through some more slides and get us to the activity. But let me pause for a moment and see if you have any questions at this point.
And Troy, after you get done with your water, could you please, because we've had a lot of people come in since you have last put the link in. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Becky. I appreciate the reminder. All right, so again, I am going to, by necessity, fast forward just a little bit through these slides. We would, if we had a little bit more time in like a half-day workshop, we'd kind of work through all of these, and you can see them hidden in the actual slide deck. You can go in, you can click the links and try them out. I'll just kind of reiterate this point that different communities recognize authority in different ways. There are different people that qualify as expert. Maybe a hobbyist is considered an expert in one context, but someone that works in the field is considered an expert in another. Sometimes experts are considered not to be the most authoritative and need to be, put on par with someone who's experiencing something in their local community. And so we want to continue to think about where that expertise lies. Again, I mentioned reading laterally a few moments ago. You can explore that more if you would like to, talking about fact checking and so forth. The creation is a process. Again, we can talk about formats. There was a slide embedded in here about thinking about infographics. We can also think about podcasts. We can think about websites. We can think about timelines. As Jessica made a moment ago, we can think about the idea related to that infographic showing Napoleon's march. Infographics are becoming more and more popular again. So we want to think about all the ways that we can have students consume information as well as create it. We next want to be thinking about the idea of value. There are some slides in there and some information about copyright and fair use and Creative Commons. And especially as I'm working with teachers and helping them think about creating digital stories, websites, timelines, podcasts, there are lots of questions about how we can use existing media resources. And that is a whole other presentation. But my short answer is to definitely check out this code of best practices for fair use. Watch the video that's embedded by Renee Hobbs. And if you still have questions about whether or not you feel you or your students have fair use rights, certainly send me a message and I can follow up with you on that. We're going to talk a lot more about inquiry in a moment. And one of the things I think we need to talk about pretty clearly with our students in this inquiry process is that we all start from somewhere. There has been a shift in the field of journalism, a shift in the fields of research, both quantitative and qualitative, where, many years ago, and I think back to like my own undergraduate and graduate education, this idea of objectivity and neutrality was pretty firm. And I think now we're all starting to recognize that we come to the table with our own perspectives and other people come with them too. And so I use these tools, and the activity I'm going to share with you is something I've done with freshmen in college. I've also worked on this. I've done an adaptation of this with middle school. And I think having students do something like a political typology quiz can be illuminating. And that then opens up some conversations about why they believe what they believe and where their beliefs come from. And even though we can sometimes get into things that feel a little, either or, this or that, left or right, it still is important to use tools like this to open up the conversation and help us understand where we are situated in these arguments. A few more resources. We're going to come back to all sides in just a few moments. And again, this is the key idea that I want to hone in on tonight. Scholarship is conversation. We want to engage students in a dialogue. Writing an academic argument is not just about, oh, here's my thing, here's 3 supporting points, here's the one thing to counterpoint and refute and be done with it, and then here's my point again. This comes from a philosopher and literary scholar, Kenneth Burke. He first wrote about this idea of like entering the academic conversation by using this metaphor of the parlor. He kind of mixes metaphors towards the end and then talks a little bit about dipping in your oar. But it's this idea that we all come to the conversation at different points, and we're not going to solve everything in the one contribution we make. We have to listen, we have to respond, we have to be open to continuing the conversation later. And we're going to actually use a couple sentence templates from a book called They Say, I Say. Graf and Birkenstein are two English professors who studied law cases and looked at the ways that law cases, the write-ups were composed. What were the words and phrases that signaled and made transitions between ideas and acknowledged points and counterpoints and articulated why the author's points were important? And so we're going to use a couple of their templates as we move forward. And with that, I think I'm going to, I'm going to leave those other slides for you. You have them there. You can go check them out and explore. But we're going to move into an activity here in just a few moments. I'm going to give you a very top level overview of the activity, and then I'm going to welcome you to open up a Google Doc. And if you want to kind of go through the activity, you can go through the activity on your own. I will also kind of model and emulate for you what the activity might look like. So what's going to happen, and if you need this link, let me copy it for you directly, and I will try to put that into the chat. And I see someone sent me a message in the chat. I will try to respond to you in a few moments. Thank you. But this should be the shared Google Doc. It should be a view only, and you should be able to then copy that to your own drive if you would like to. Let me walk you through the steps and what's going to happen. This is a project that I've kind of constructed and refined over the past couple of years. I teach it in a first-year seminar. It's a writing intensive course, and the course itself is broadly about the sociology of the internet. So it's not a freshman composition class per se, but it is a freshman class, and it's largely geared at helping students become able to do their own research. So this is an activity we do early in the course, usually by week 3 or 4. It definitely takes 2 class periods. Either when I teach the class as a 3-hour seminar, it takes the whole night, or if I teach it over 2 days, it takes a couple class periods. So you'd have to think about how you would adapt it for your own students. Go ahead and take a look at that, and I'm going to walk you through the different sections of it, and then I'll model for you in the document itself what it's going to look like. So there's kind of 5 major moves that I make in this lesson. The first idea is that I just want them to pre-write before they open Google, before they go to the library database, before they open up Pro-Con or the New York Times or All Sides. I want them to start thinking about their topic and to start articulating what they already know about their topic. So you'll see that in that first pre-writing. The second part is that we then get into looking at the topic, and I invite them to use all sides, and I'll demonstrate for you how I do this, but they open up 2 different perspectives, one from the political ideological right perspective, one from the political ideological left. And they take a snapshot of a screenshot of the source, and we talk about a media literacy analysis of that source with the visual rhetoric. We then do a textual analysis where we actually quite literally copy the words out of the article and we make word clouds. So we can see how those ideologies are represented, because sometimes we can read a document, we can even do the lateral reading, right? We can have the 2 documents open, but it's really hard to unpack and see those ideologies until we see it from a little bit more of what my colleague Tom Lynch would call a distant reading. So Tom Liam Lynch writes about this idea of doing like a close reading of the text as a literature scholar, but then taking a corpus of text and stepping away from it and doing a distant reading, which is what we'll look at when we do the word cloud. Then I'm a fan of protocols. There are so many protocols from groups like the National School Reform Faculty or Harvard Project Zero's visible thinking routines. So you'll see in the next segment of that document, there's the considering evidence protocol, and we'll kind of walk through how that works. And again, trying to get students to think about what's counting as evidence for this particular source, what's counting as evidence for that particular source, who gets to say this in the eyes of these 2 sources. How are they warranting their arguments with different kinds of evidence? What are they bringing to the argument? And then finally, we use the sentence template. We take one of those sentence templates from They Say, I Say, and we start to craft an argument of their own. If we have time, we'll move into that discussion and feedback during the class session, but that is also something I might have them do asynchronously beyond the class session. All right, so let me walk you through this. Now, my hope is that you're able to open this up and look at it, and I'm going to just double check so I know that I've got the document on screen. I will pull that up as well so I can take a look. But I recently updated this, and I imagine that I was going through an argument about school reopenings, obviously something that's current and contemporary and controversial. And there are many perspectives on that argument. So what I would do before they get to Google, before they go to anywhere, we would be in that part one. And I would say, I want you just to write. What have you heard? What are the words and phrases that are associated with this? When you hear this, do you hear the words school reopening? Do you hear words like mandated versus volunteering versus partial versus hybrid? What are the words? Take some time to write. So they would spend some time sharing their initial thoughts. Now, I do want them to go through this process before we go to the current news. Hey, where do you normally go? And at least for my students, 99 out of 100 of them say Google. So we will do a screen, we'll do a search, and then I have them do the screen captures. So for instance, like right now, if you're in the view only document with me, I would be taking that Google screen capture and I would have them do that. And I teach them how to do it, whether they're on Chromebooks or whatever. And then they would import, they would actually go ahead and they would bring in that screen capture right there. So, I'm not going to do all that importing right now, but if I were to go up to the insert menu and go to image, I could upload from my computer, from my camera, from my Google Drive and things like that. You would see how that could work. Then we talk a little bit about the search engine DuckDuckGo, which is meant to kind of push them outside of their normal search. And DuckDuckGo does not track with cookies. It does not track based on location. It does not track on your previous browser history. So it is something that you can use to give a more neutral kind of look at the web. So Google, of course, I'm searching, and here's what my Google search looks like as compared to the more neutral and open DuckDuckGo search. And you could have them, if you wanted to, in those two columns that I'm highlighting right now. You could have them either import the screenshot, or you might just say, hey, just type your list. And so it might look more like this. So for me, I might say, okay, well, in Google, I got my top hits of news from these sources, and then my other sources, and then from DuckDuckGo, I got these, and then you have them compare. What do you notice about this list? What does this make you think as you look across the sources that showed up for you in Google, and then what showed up for you in DuckDuckGo? Where are the similarities? Where are the differences? Why do you think it is that Google knew that you would be going back to some of these previous sources? And why is it that you think DuckDuckGo prioritizes some of these other media sources? So we could have a little media literacy kind of conversation right around there. I'm going to pause for just a moment, see if there's any questions that anyone might have, or if anyone's done a similar type of thing using DuckDuckGo as a web browser, or as a web search engine, pardon me. All right, so far so good. Well, again, feel free to interrupt me, drop a note in the chat, or feel free to take the mic when we have those moments to pause. Now we're going to move on to that next stage, the part two, where we're getting into that exploring context and gaining insights. And what would happen then is that I would be teaching them a little bit about going to all sides. And I want to model that for you. So I'm going to break out of my Google slide deck here and say, give you just a little bit of insights on how you would do that. All Sides is a crowdsourced media platform where they take and they curate resources from across the web, And we can have a deeper conversation about how they actually go about doing their media biased crowdsource rankings. You could also look a little bit into the ways that they've structured their advisory board. But you can find out just a little bit more about it here. And I'm not going to play these videos right now, but you can look at how they structure their advisory board and things like that. But what I do want to show you is that they have this dictionary. And I like the dictionary because you can go in and you can find a particular topic. I'm going to look at climate change, for example, because I know it has this piece right here that I want to really point out. It's got a nice definition. It's got some questions that you can continue to help your students explore. And then it also has related terms. So when we're reading these other sources, what is it that we might notice about these dictionary terms? Why might we hear the phrase climate change in one context, but hear climate skeptic in another context, or carbon footprint in another context? And that's really important. And then, of course, there are these topical guides that you can go in and look at from there. And then there's the balanced search. The one thing that I try to tell students is that, like, if we go in and say we're looking under coronavirus and you're really interested in school reopenings, make sure that you're finding, articles that are about school reopenings. So as you can see in the slide deck, and I captured that the other day, the articles, there were 2 articles about school reopenings. And because you want to compare, kind of apples to apples, you don't want to compare an article about school reopenings to an article about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or an article about Cuomo in New York. You want to compare 2 articles, one from the left and one from the right, about school openings. So you'll see that as you dig in and you start to look at the topics. And then what happens, what's nice, is that, you go ahead and you click into it, and it will open it in a new tab. So lateral reading is kind of happening for you automatically. So I could look at nursing homes here, and I'm sure I can probably find something on nursing homes. Well, of course I can't right now, but I'm just gonna open one up for right now. You'll kind of get the point. So again, we'll see the initial overview of it, and then you can have your students click in to read the full story in context. And so they can open it up and they can see it in context. Now, what's interesting, I have my ad blocker on right now. Yet another media digital literacy lesson we could talk about is how many things are being blocked on any one site. But no, I'm going to dismiss that for now. And so we could talk about that. I'll go back to the slide deck. You can kind of see how I've illustrated some of these things. And again, I would invite the students to pull in these screenshots, and then they would go through the media literacy questions. What do you notice? Who created this message? Well, yes, it was the New York Times, the New York Post, but what do you know about these sources? And you can go back to all sides, or as I had in the slides a few earlier, you could take them to the Adfontes media bias ratings tool, which gives another look at media ideology, and talk to them about that. You can have them then think a little bit more about, what are the techniques that are being used, what's in the headline, what do you notice about the dominant image in the text, and how does all that kind of work for you as a reader. So you would move them through these questions, and they would answer that in this segment of the document, and then they'd synthesize across. All right. Then this is where it gets interesting. So again, talking about my friend and colleague, Tom Liam Lynch, he taught me this strategy and I really like it. And it uses a tool called Voyant. And Voyant tool, you can link to it from the document. Let me drag it over here to show you how we're going to do this. So you can then have students take the text, and you can, if you have a reader view type of tool installed, sometimes that's helpful to get rid of all the clutter. You might have to install that extension. You can, of course, just look at it in kind of regular view, and then you can have them just kind of copy the headline. But you got to be careful that they don't copy all the ad stuff. That's not what you want them to copy. So I'm going to put it in reader view for a moment, and we'll capture it here. Oh, and of course now, see, it disappeared. Oh, rats. So I am going to have to go back and copy it the other way. So Voyant, just to show you what that looks like. Again, there's this text box, and we just want to capture the text. We want to get the text in there so we can create that nice, clean word cloud. So I'm just copying that text, dropping it in right there. I'm going to go back here again. I'm going to scroll down. Again, I want to make sure I'm not getting all the other advertisement type stuff. So I'm just going to grab that text. I'm going to copy it and put it in there. And I'm going to go back and get the last couple segments of the text too. I'm not even trying to get the captions off the photographs. I just want the text of the article. So I put all that text in there and grab that one. That should be enough for right now, just so you can see how Voyant works. Of course, there is a little more. Oh, no, just a little tiniest bit more. So I'll grab that last little tiniest bit as well. All right, so I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to say reveal, and watch what Voyant does for us. Now, this is a tool that linguists, my fellow colleagues, like in English and linguistics, would use this tool. It looks a little overwhelming and complicated, but I'm going to show you the two things that I think are most important. The one thing is that you can adjust the size for the number of terms that you would pull out. I'm going to move it to 25, so we just have a nice kind of clear image right there. And then there's this phrase. This corpus of one document has 485 total words with 263 unique word forms. So that's kind of interesting. You can talk to students like, oh, so there's roughly 500 words, and a lot of them are repeated. Isn't that kind of interesting to see how there are different words that are repeated over and over, and see how we notice those in the word cloud? Now, from the other day, I'm going to go back to the word clouds that I already created so we can kind of look at this. And I apologize, I forgot to update the link from last time. I'll delete that and put in the right link for our session. But you can see in the word clouds that we have, this is the one that had the schools reopening. This one was from the political right, and this one was from the political left. I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to push this back into full screen because I really do want you to take a look and just think for a few moments about what you see. And here are some questions for you to consider. I'm going to put the questions in the chat, and I'm going to actually pause for a moment and stop talking. Feel free to put your response in the chat, or after about a minute of radio silence here, I'll welcome one or two of you to take the microphone. So take a look at the word clouds. You saw the screenshots of the two articles, but now think about what you see in the word clouds. So if you would like to contribute to the chat, feel free to add a few ideas. What do you notice as you look at these two word clouds? Now, I didn't clean any of these up at all. If I had been a little bit more diligent about it, I probably would have combined school and schools and things like that. I just took these as kind of the raw word counts. So please note that. And also, I would have probably tried to find articles that were roughly the same length. So unfortunately, I have the 1,300 words here, and then I've got 300 some words over there, which is not quite comparing the same length of article, but at least you kind of get the gist of it. A few things that are coming out in the chat, and again, I would welcome any of you if you'd like to take the microphone. The source, yep, definitely has way more words. Yep, very, very different lengths. Yeah, so again, I would, if I'd had more time and I was trying to get kids to really do a deeper analysis, I'd probably try to find articles of roughly the same length. But even that is important to note too, because when these two articles show up on a Facebook feed or when they show up on a Twitter feed, all you're seeing is the headline and maybe a little quote. And then you can talk about context and nuance and more evidence being presented. although both seem to have schools at the heart. One seems to be reopening over guidance. Yeah, so we see the word reopen being very dominant over the word guidance, right? And even as we look back, we might see something like that showing up in the example I just did too. Any other observations? I'm gonna put the screenshots back up from the two. What are some observations that you might have noted about these two articles as well? And what kind of emotional appeals might these two articles be making, both in terms of the words in the headline, as well as the dominant images that, again, would show up in a social media feed? All right, we see in the chat, coronavirus comes up a few times in the National Review article, but the AP doesn't use words like transmission um, uh, or corona or coronavirus. Yeah. Yeah, again, and Stan has captured it really well. CDC guidance for schools versus schools reopen. Yes. All right. So you're getting the gist of this. And I think the idea would be then as students are deeply involved in their own inquiry and they're starting to see um, these differences across the political ideologies, that then is a moment to kind of pause and go back and say, hey, yes, we can have continued conversations about, what all sides has put for their own media bias rankings. And we could discuss whether you think, the Atlantic is to the left or to the right, or the AP is in the center, or the New York Post is to the right. But a lot of people have rated these things and agree. And then this would also be an interesting moment to go to that ad fontes chart, right? And to start talking about, well, why do other people rate these things the way they do? What do we notice about the reasons for why these things are rated the way they are? Because you'll notice on that ad fontes chart, they talk about things that are generally, at the top are fairly just trying to tell you the who, what, when, not necessarily who, what, when, where, not necessarily all the details about the why and how and deeper analysis. I don't know why Ed Fontes isn't loading up, so I'll pause on that for a moment. The other thing that I think is really important is that all sides lately, anything that doesn't have a label on it is generally kind of considered to be pretty much straight up news reporting, who, what, when, where, and some why and how. But then you can see analysis, you can see fact check, and sometimes you'll even see opinion come out. So there's this gradation, right? Like not all news sources are doing the same thing. Some are meant to be a typical news source, some are meant to be a fact check, some are more meant to be a deeper analysis. So that can be an interesting conversation to have with students as well. All right, so then we move into the part that as a writing teacher, I love the most. So students have started to analyze their sources. They've really dug in. They've started to think about all the different things they see. Then they get to that considering evidence protocol. So let me show that. And this is where we really ask them to say, all right, what are you noticing? What counts as evidence, for whom, and in what context? Are they using quotes? Are they using statistics? Are they using additional photos? Are they using video clips? What are they using? So when we dig in and we look, for instance, at the New York Post article, we could start to read, and I'm reading really quickly. We have a little quote, one-word quote from Fauci. We have another quote from Collins. So we have quotes from two experts. We have another quote. We have another quote. But none of those quotes are mentioning any statistics or anything like that. Mentions another expert, but doesn't quote or anything like that. Okay, so a couple quotes, and then it actually links out to some additional sources too. So we could say, links out to additional sources. Then there's this question. What is the perspective? So what do we know about the New York Post when we look at the media bias chart? What do we start to know when we think about the analysis based on the word cloud? What do we notice? and we see words in there. What are the dominant words that we see showing up? Breathtaking and speed and the comparison to the Manhattan Project. And how would we notice, what would we notice if we looked at a different source who had talked about that in a different way? So it could be interesting to do those comparing and contrasting. And so after they've compared their evidence, they then start to write the argument of their own. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So we use one of these two templates, and if I had to lean one way over the other, I'd probably choose this one because I think it's a little simpler, and it also ends with this, my own view is. And they're basically forming what I would call kind of a kernel essay or a thesis paragraph or something like that. This is their first attempt at making their own argument. So we would say, in discussions of schools reopening during the coronavirus pandemic, one controversial issue has been whether and how to follow the CDC guidance. On the one hand, and then they could go back to their sources, right? And they would dig in and they'd look. On the one hand, the National Review cites CDC evidence and argues da 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 da. You could even have them pull in a quote from the source right there. On the other hand, the AP News reports that, and so we might take that word out. We might say AP News reports blah, 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 drag in a quote, put that in there. And then others might even believe, and you could, let's pull in a third source, or let's pull in something that's happening locally for us. And my own view is such and such. And they have to articulate their own view at this point. So they use this little template to kind of get themselves started. And then what's great is they can continue to expand and it can continue to grow. If you click on this Birkenstein's They Say, I Say templates, Dave Stewart Jr., who teaches over Becky, is it Cedar? I want to say Cedar Rapids, but I think it's Cedar Springs right over there by, yes, thanks. So Dave Stewart, he gathered all these templates from Jared Graff and Kathy Birkenstein's book. Questionable. I think it's fair use that he copied these out of there and uses them in this way. And you could have your students go and make a copy of this document, but you could then have them take those initial ideas and they could elaborate on them by bringing in more quotes. They could introduce other views. There are the two that I copied and pasted into my own document. They could introduce quotations. They could name the naysayer. They can make a concession and do all these types of things. And there are even some great transition words for you at the end. So having done all that, they would then have their kernel essay that they could then take and continue to move from there. These just quickly are some peer conversation stems. I want to show you real fast one example of student work and then take the last few moments for questions because I know we'll get booted out of our Zoom room here pretty quickly. I know that Becky will remind me of that if I don't stop. There is our actual link. Sorry, I didn't get it in there the right way earlier, but there it is to go back to later if you need it or want to share it with someone else. And then here is an example. So when I did this project with my students a couple semesters ago, did it early in the semester, and two of the students actually liked the activity so much. And obviously, as you can see, we're exploring a contemporary and controversial topic, just like I told them to, wanted to do their final class project on the topic of abortion. And what was really interesting is that they took their first couple articles that they found in All Sides, they kept finding more. They did some academic research. They found that other scholars were investigating the linguistic debates around the language of abortion. And so they were able to look at that and find out what other scholars had been saying. They were able to generate their word clouds from sources on the political left and sources on the political right. And then they engaged in a deeper analysis. And they took this one class activity and they said, we really like this, Dr. Hicks, can we take this? Can we do something more? And they turned it into their final project proposal, and then they created this for their final project. So they moved from that one little tiny kernel paragraph into a fully sustained research project that took them the rest of the semester. With that, let me pause for a moment. I know we have just a minute or two left. If there are any questions that you might have, and again, I'll drop my contact info. I know you've got it on the slide deck, but I'll be sure to put it in the chat if you're saving the chat as well. Um, Anyone have any questions that you would like to ask? Or perhaps Becky, you have a question. I know you've seen bits and parts of this before, but maybe you saw something new tonight that you might have another question.
Yeah, I'm not seeing one come in, so I'm gonna ask a question here. Troy, you and I have talked about this before with DBQs, right? And
Yep.
that because it's a well scaffolded process, it's very difficult to have students thinking and writing about their thinking at a level 4 when we think about levels of cognitive demand and rigor. And then I'm looking at yours, which is also a very scaffolded process. Talk to me about how we get that level 4 level of cognitive demand and arguing really going on here.
Yeah, I think it's about iteration, so iterate, 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 come back to it. So when you start it one day, they do that initial analysis. Hey, this is great. We're going to step away from this. We're going to dig into our unit now. We're going to look at some other sources. Hey, remember what we did on Monday? Let's pull that out again. Let's look at that again. And then those Graf and Birkenstein sentence templates, I think, are amazing. Some people worry, like, oh, isn't that kind of 5-paragraph essay-ish? And what I would argue is, yes, kind of, but not really. I think you can take those and you can really get them to be, deeper, more substantive prompts. If you're super worried about it, you don't want it to be too scripted. As I mentioned before, one of my favorite sites for getting some good thinking routines is Harvard Project Zero. I'll grab the chat. I'm sure it's going to pull up in my search history. Thank you, Google. There we go. I'll drop it in the chat. So Harvard Project Zero, this is like the home of the I See, I Think, I Wonder, Connect, Extend Challenge. I used to think, now I think. You could take one of those and then okay, we did our DBQ. Let's step back from it. And now let's do I See, I Think, I Wonder, or let's do I Think, Pair, Share, or let's do something like that. And then again, you iterate, you come back to it a few days later, and then that might be, where you then pull in one of those other templates. Well, let's name what's a counterpoint, what's a substantive argument that you could make forward. So I think it's just that, I don't know how long a DBQ typically takes one person. Sometimes maybe it takes just one class period. Sometimes maybe it stretches out over a couple days. But I would say, like, use that text and keep coming back to it over the course of a whole unit. Don't feel like you do it and you get it done, but welcome students to take a break from it and come back to it again later. I hope that helps.
It does. That's a really good idea. I really like that. Right now we are looking at 6:32. So I don't know at what time we're going to get kicked off, but they assure me it will be soon. But while we're waiting to be kicked off, does anyone have a question for Troy?
Thank you for the kind words there in the chat. Well, great. Well, what I would say too, if I could, is that I really do appreciate, the opportunity to speak to an audience of social studies teachers. As Becky knows, I always say I'm an ELA guy, but I'm dipping my toes in the world of the C3 and social studies, and I really do appreciate hearing your perspectives on this. So please do email. It's great to see a few familiar faces from the project that Becky and I have been working on this year with the Teaching Primary Sources, and we might have some more resources and updates from that group coming out later this spring and into the summer. So keep your eyes and ears open for some possible new unit plans and webinars that group might be producing, which I'm really, really excited about. So thank you again to all of you. And Becky, I'll let you take it away for closing words.
Thanks, everyone. Please make sure that you've got your name in the chat if you are working toward SCECHs. Other than that, we'll let everyone get to their next session. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.